We are now going to move into our next session. Anti-Semitism is everyone's problem. Considering the dangers anti-Semitism poses to free societies is a conversation that will allow us to put two of what I consider to be the greatest public intellectuals of the modern era on your screens on our virtual stage. Dr. Barbara Kirshenblatt-Gimblett, University Professor Emerita at NYU, and also the Ronald S. Lauder Chief Curator of the POLIN Museum of the History of Polish Jews in Warsaw, curator of the permanent exhibition, core exhibition, will be joined in conversation by Dr. Tim Snyder, the Levin Professor of History and the Fortunoff Archive Faculty Advisor at Yale University. Dr. Snyder is also the permanent fellow at the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna. I have had the distinct pleasure of working with both of you over the course of my career, and I am thrilled for what this conversation will be. So, ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, Tim and Barbara, thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Michael, for organizing the event today and for the invitation to have a conversation with Tim. I can't think of anything I would rather do. So Tim, without any further ado, I would like to ask you to respond to the title of our session. Anti-Semitism is everyone's problem, considering the dangers anti-Semitism poses to free societies.
Well, so why don't we, Barbara? First of all, it's a great pleasure to talk to you. You know, I'm in awe of your achievements, and as far as I know, we've never actually had a chance to talk one-on-one. And the fact that we're doing it in front of so many nice and important people just makes it all the better. So I'm very glad to be with you and with all of you. Let's both take a stab at that. The first thing I'm going to point out is that if anti-Semitism concerns all of us, that means that it also concerns non-Jews. And if it concerns non-Jews, then we have to try to think about anti-Semitism from the point of view of non-Jews and see where that leads us in terms of its connection to other forms of xenophobia and racism. Which leads me to the second thing, my second reaction. I'm going to try to say in these reactions things that maybe other people haven't said before. One thing that I find significant about the rise of anti-Semitism is its connection to conspiracy thinking in general. Anti-Semitism, of course, at least in some of its more terrifying variants, is a form of conspiracy thinking. The idea that there's some clear, simple story about who runs the world, for example. And so I think that it's not a coincidence that conspiracy theories in general are rising at the same time that anti-Semitism in particular is rising, which means that if we're concerned about anti-Semitism as a particularly terrifying and historically destructive form of conspiracy thinking, we have to be thinking about why conspiracy thinking is rising, which leads me to my third quick thought, which is I think the rise of anti-Semitism has a great deal to do with the way that social media works. And, you know, much as we address ourselves to other human beings, and that's terribly important, one of the things we're going to have to be concerned about is the way that the machines that are so important in our lives don't have values and how we have to impose our values on those machines. So those are some of the things which come to mind, like right off that prompt. We have a lot of other things we want to talk about, and I want to hear what you think too, Barbara.
Oh, thank you, Tim. Well, what I would say is that our focus today in our conversation is on the role of museums, libraries, and archives in dealing and addressing anti-Semitism. And so my position would be that the tools that we use in those institutions can be a model for how to fight hate more generally. And so what I'd like to do is to come back to this question in our conversation about how I see museums functioning, because I believe that the way that museums can, and I know that you're going to talk about archives, but maybe we should do it that way, that the ways in which we see, in your case, archives, in my case, museums, tackling the issue of anti-Semitism, how those ways could offer tools and models for confronting other forms of hate. So that's how I would maybe come at it. But now I'd like to turn more specifically to the role of archives. I know that you've been very involved in the Fortunoff archive. As an historian, archives are absolutely fundamental to the work that you do. And so my question to you is, what is how do you see the role of archives in not only the study of anti-Semitism and its worst outcomes, but also its role in fighting anti-Semitism?
Mm-hmm. I guess I should preface this by saying, you and I are coming at this from slightly different positions, and we are coming at this from maybe slightly different positions than others. I come at this as a historian who's written about the Holocaust. So insofar as I think I understand something about anti-Semitism, it's mostly in connection with the events of the Holocaust, and that's going to affect my answer. I think archives are very important as an old-fashioned medium that needs to be preserved. I think it's very important for us not to always be rolling along to what we think the next new medium is going to be, because sometimes the old media are very important. The entire history of the Holocaust, history, I'm going to stress the word history, as we have it, is based almost entirely on archives of one sort or another. And those archives have not been fully exploited. In our lifetime, and you know this extremely well because of POLIN, in our lifetime, sources about the Holocaust have opened up from the Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, which have just barely been touched. I mean, the surface has just been scratched. There's still no history of the Holocaust in whole big countries, like, for example, Poland. There's no single history of the Holocaust in no synthetic history, right? So I would stress that we need archives because we need history. We can't over rely on new media, and we have to be precisely out of respect for the memory of survivors. We have to make sure that the memory of survivors is girded and supported by all of the other source material that's out there. And then the final thing I want to say about archives this time around is that archives are there to make sure that what we see is fresh and authentic and convincing. It's very important to understand that that understanding of the Holocaust and anti-Semitism is something that must continue to evolve as we do fresh and new research. If it doesn't, then it starts to become implausible and inaccessible. So learning more and telling the story in different ways over time, that also depends upon maintaining archives, maintaining languages, maintaining people's access to archives.
Well, I'm really struck by those reflections, and I'm completely with you. And I'm thinking about the anxiety that I believe many Holocaust museums feel as they contemplate a world that is beyond living memory. Because I think certainly to the degree that museums, especially, less so archives, but to the degree that museums form a bridge between the academy and the public, they have depended and have had the extraordinary resource of living witnesses. And as we approach a time where we'll be in a world that is literally beyond living memory, there is the feeling that somehow we're at a loss. But in fact, all history is beyond living memory. There's no living memory of the Civil War. There's no living memory of the Khmelnytsky uprising. There's memory, but not the memory of, if you will, living witnesses. There are no living witnesses to history, basically. And so, in the face of that prospect, there is the archive, and the archive is almost, I would say, it has a depth that remains to be plumbed, and it will take many, many lifetimes to plumb. It's an extraordinary resource. And I think that what I'm hearing from your comment is that one of the primary roles of the archive is to support primary research on a range of sources that have yet to be plumbed, and a return to sources that have been plumbed but are approached with new questions and with fresh ideas. Do you want to reflect on that?
Yeah, no, that's a wonderful way to set it up. I mean, first of all, I mean, just by way of reassurance, it's important to remember that the field of Holocaust history began without the survivors. I mean, there's a problem with that, but I'm just going to state it as a fact. Raoul Hilberg is not really relying on survivor sources when he begins the historical study of the Holocaust. There's a debate in Germany in the late 1980s called the Historikerstreit, in which Schall Friedlander very correctly makes the point that in all these German perspectives, the Jewish perspective is missing, and we can't possibly do this without the Jewish perspective. And he's absolutely right. And that's a turning point in history. And then since then, we've brought in more and more survivor voices. But those voices that have been brought in have chiefly been archival sources. They've chiefly been things that are recorded. They've chiefly been video testimonies of the kind we have at Fortunoff or at USC or in other places. But more than that, far more numerous than that, are written sources. People often speak about the Holocaust as if there were no primary sources from the victims, and that's simply not true. We have thousands and thousands and thousands, actually tens of thousands of written sources from the victims, so often in languages that people don't study, but nevertheless, those sources are there. So I personally, as a historian of anti-Semitism and the Holocaust, am deeply discomforted when I hear people talk about how there's something gray or something forgotten or how somehow this history is impossible. It's a terrible history. It's the most important, in my view, historical event of the 20th century, but it has sources, and we have to be very careful that we marshal those sources and take care of those sources so that we can have precisely a living history, an evolving history, a convincing history that we can keep writing and keep bringing into our classrooms in an ever more persuasive and accessible way.
Yes, and I think also, and I want to turn in a moment to the Fortuna archive, but I think that a very productive, if you will, avenue would be the relationship between survivor testimony and in real time recording of the experience. So of course, you know, my touchstone for this is the Oinig Shabbos underground, the Warsaw Underground Archive that was organized and led by Emanuel Ringelblum. And one of the things that Sam Kassow stresses is that in the testimonies, diaries, letters, and various reportage and various other documents that were created in real time on the spot by those who didn't have a horizon forward. Their horizon forward was very, very narrow until eventually they did know what their fate would be. That we find them saying things then, and even in the case of survivors, that they wouldn't say later, that they wouldn't say now. And I think that the relationship between those kinds of testimonies is a very productive place for us to go as we think forward. But perhaps a way to come at that would be for you to say something about the actually very unique character and unique history of the Fortunoff archive.
Okay, let me just say, I would love to. I want to just first give one more general reflection, if I could, on the basis of what you've just said. The survivor testimonies, which come later, and the first person sources that we have from the period itself, both have the feature that they surprise us. They don't always say the things that we expect them to say, and that's extremely important for historical research. It's extremely important because if we're going to be concerned about anti-Semitism today and in the future, we have to know how anti-Semitism interacts with other kinds of events. And it's these first-person sources which can make those connections, right? So to say that there is anti-Semitism or that there's growing anti-Semitism is, of course, true. But one of the things these first-person sources can do is they can make the connections between the anti-Semitism and other kinds of events, which then lead to truly terrible outcomes. But thank you for the question about Fortunoff. I mean, Fortunoff was founded in New Haven in the 1970s on the basis of what was a cutting edge technology at the time, namely the video cassette recorder. We have all in all more than 7,000 testimonies from what was begun as a community project of survivors, which later was incorporated into the library of Yale University, and which is now run by Stephen Nairn. It's interesting to see how, that I'm just going to give this as an example, that medium which seemed so avant-garde at the time, we of course had to replace, right? We had to digitize everything. And of course, and now we're undertaking a project where we take some of the most important testimonies and we annotate them. We have a written version where a scholar takes months and months and months and footnotes them historically so that testimony is accessible and comprehensible for everyone, which is a very old-fashioned thing to do. But the result is that a testimony then speaks to everyone in a way that it didn't before. We've also used a couple of new old technologies to try to make these testimonies more accessible in a way that we think is faithful to the intentions of the people who originally set them down. One are podcasts, which is basically annotating the testimony, but in sound. So we've released parts of some of our testimonies as podcasts with commentary, again, to set it in context so that people can understand. And we've been very selective and very careful about how we've done that. And another thing which Stephen Nairn has done, which is extremely innovative and I think quite beautiful in its way, with the help of Zissel Slipovich, who's now our musician in residence, Stephen has, and other scholars, Stephen has gone through our testimonies to search for music, because survivors, or actually people who don't survive, often record in the sources they leave behind music, songs that were sung in camps, songs that were meaningful to them. And those songs, of course, already existed. They're in their minds. And what we've done is we have trying to find those songs and score those songs and record those songs, because then we extract from the testimony something which is surprising and living, but also true to what people meant to have recorded. It seems strange, but in Holocaust testimony, sometimes people actually do sing. They'll sing a few bars of a song. And we think this is the kind of thing which is worth updating and making accessible.
Yes, and what I think that's a very, very good point, but it's also an example of this bridging between, well, whether it's the Academy or the archive as a resource first and foremost for scholars and the public, which I think is very much at the heart of our conversation today. There's one last thing I wanted to invite you to comment on with regard to the Fortunoff archive, and that is that the way it was conceived and the, if you will, sort of psychological sensitivity that guided the interviews with, not only guided the interviews with survivors, but also the protocols for viewing the testimonies. And I wondered if you might comment on that.
I can comment. I mean, of course, I wasn't there for this. This was the work of the founders. But the premise, of course, was that the survivors had to be approached on a terrain which was comfortable for them, including a psychological terrain that was comfortable for them. And the questioning, when it was done at its best, was done in a way which was both informed but also extremely careful in a human way, because one also has to take into account, you know, as you suggest, the way you form the question, the intergenerational character of a lot of the motivation of the survivors. People are talking to their children, or they're talking to their grandchildren, or it's the grandchildren of the children who are in some sense behind the emergence of the story in the first place. And there was a sensitivity to that. And it's partly for that reason that it took us years and decades to think about just how we would make this collection more accessible, and why we've moved very much step by step as we've done this and considered and reconsidered before we put those testimonies in the other form besides the one in which they originally arose.
Yes, and also just one little side note, and that is to mention the David Boder collection of sound recordings interviewing survivors immediately after the war in Europe. And it's a very, very extraordinary collection. So, in fact, the audio recording of survivors is something that began immediately after the war in Europe. So, I just wanted to mention that. So, moving on, I wanted to say something about how I see the role of museums.
Yes, please.
And I think that in a way, when I think, well, of course, archives, first and foremost, archives are a repository, but we know that they're a repository, they facilitate the research of scholars, but they also have a role vis-a-vis the public. Not only the public coming to use the archive, but also in basically presenting and interpreting and communicating what's in the archive to the public. So they have a public role, but I don't think of them as, I don't think of that role as being their primary function. In the case of museums today, and of course, collecting, preservation are important, but their relationship to the public is primary. They are really a visitor-focused institution on the basis, on the foundation of rigorous scholarship and authentic collections, documents, all kinds of materials. But it's in their relationship to society that I see them playing an extremely important role in confronting anti-Semitism. And that is that they, first and foremost, as a bridge between the academy and the public. This, for me, is absolutely critical, and that it's one of the reasons why museums and libraries and archives are considered among the most trusted institutions within a democracy. And as trusted institutions, they are a kind of a defense against the promiscuity and the unregulated nature of social media, and of course, the ways in which social media fuels conspiracy theories. So the element of trust, that one of the most important things museums, archives, and libraries can do is to foster that trust, to earn it, to deserve it, to protect that element of trust. So, and because without that, I don't, the ship is sunk. So that's the first thing. It's a bridge between the academy and society, and these are institutions that are trusted, and that is one of their greatest tools. That's the first thing. The second is that I see these institutions, and the public library for sure, but also the research library, I see as one of its major functions is what I call the strengthening of civil society. And how to do that, because it's only in the strengthening of civil society that you can, at the grassroots, try to tackle some of these systemic problems. Now, I know that if a problem is systemic, and if we were to treat anti-Semitism, racism, xenophobia, if we were to treat them not simply as a matter of psychology or personal issues or individual, but we were to treat them systemically, that the solutions are not only systemic solutions, they are also solutions that have to be found at the grassroots and through the strengthening of civil society. And how can museums do it? And it's something I feel very strongly about with regard to POLIN Museum of the History of Polish Jews in Warsaw. And I would like to think that, and if we had a longer conversation, we could explore some of the specific ways. But let me at least target some very, very specific, if you will, I would say 21st century capabilities or competencies that I think museums are in a very, very good position to foster. One of them would be media literacy, and that seems to me to be critical. That, I mean, obviously schools do it, and there are universities presumably do it, but I think that because museums are institutions of informal learning, they're voluntary. People come there voluntarily, and the kind of learning that they do in museums is informal. That gives us a very, very special context for fostering these 21st century competencies. So one of them would be media literacy. Another of them would be emotional intelligence, which is sorely lacking in these polarized debates. Another would be to model civil discourse. Another would be critical thinking. And particularly in the case of history museums, and I think of POLIN Museum as an institution of public history, it's a huge opportunity to foster critical thinking. And critical thinking, requires being able to take multiple perspectives, which brings us to a topic I know that you would be interested in commenting on, and very well positioned to talk about, which is to now move from discussion of history to the issue of memory and the most recent developments, which are the memory laws, Florida, Texas. I wonder if we might turn to that, because what I'd like to do in turning to that is also because I went to my local independent bookstore and I picked up 3 copies of On Tyranny, this gorgeous, illustrated, beautiful book, because I'm going to make it my go-to Hanukkah gift, my go-to Christmas gifts. It's gorgeous. But so basically, in the time that we have left, where I want to turn to is, you are a scholar, you are an historian, and you are a formidable public intellectual, and your Facebook posts in social media that the same media that fosters conspiracy theories was your platform for an initial post on how to fight tyranny that developed then into a #1 bestseller and has now evolved as this beautiful illustrated volume. And so I wondered if you might, pardon me, comment on on tyranny, your role as a public intellectual, and how that bears on some of the most recent egregious developments, which are these memory laws in Texas and Florida. I know it's a tall order, but there you have it.
Yeah, well, I mean, in connection to our subject, I would just say about On Tyranny that without the archives, it would have been impossible. And some of this, even though it's a very short book and a very accessible book, a number of the facts there are actually directly from archives, archival research, which is mine or someone else's. So there's a direct link from, if there is a freshness and accessibility in that book, it has a direct link to archival research. Because when I wrote that book, I wrote it in a couple of weeks. So I was writing it on the basis of everything that I'd done in the previous 25 years. And a lot of those 25 years were spent at archives. So there's a very, very direct connection there. Pivoting to the business about memory and history, I'm just going to stop, Barbara, on the word that you used in your description of anti-Semitism, which I think is very important, which is systemic. So when I try to categorize and analyze the voices of survivors, and I'd also like to emphasize many of the first-person sources are not from survivors. Many of the first-person sources are from people who were murdered in the Holocaust, but who nevertheless managed to leave something behind in written form. When I read those sources, what I often notice is precisely the systemic form of anti-Semitism, that of course they knew personal prejudice, but their lives were changed at the moment when their child no longer could go to kindergarten and somebody else's child went to kindergarten instead, or when they lost their property, or when they no longer had equal citizenship, or they no longer had citizenship at all. And all of those are systemic factors. They're political, but they also bring in the behavior of other people, which is what we mean when we say structural or systemic. And so in our current political fracas in the US, I'm really struck by this because, for example, in Florida, which you mentioned, there is, and I'm glad, there's legislation about teaching the Holocaust, which specifies that it should be taught as systemic, which I believe is necessary. And yet that same state, Florida, has guidance from its Department of Education, which specifies with equal determination, in fact, with a certain ferocity, that racism, American racism, must not be taught that way as systemic. And I think here we're setting ourselves up for not just an intellectual, but a terrible moral and political failure. Because if anti-Semitism is about all of us, and all of us therefore about anti-Semitism, we have to be able to understand that a basic contradiction like that is not only to be confusing, but it's a kind of moral disarmament. And it leads directly to what we saw in Texas the other day. I'm sure there's not a person in this virtual room who's not aware of what happened in Texas, which is that when you start this logic, as Texas and other states have done, of saying that education is not about confronting the difficult facts of history, but about making everyone feel comfortable, then of course you're going to throw out the history of American racism. But along that same logic, you're going to have to throw out the history of the Holocaust as well, because there are people, as I know very well, as all of you who study the Holocaust in some kind of public forum know very well, there are lots of people whom the study of the Holocaust makes uncomfortable. And so once we go down that line of swapping out history as a difficult challenge, but which makes us better citizens, swapping that out for a feeling of comfort, once we start saying that we don't have to study the systems and the structures, we're just going to treat it as personal prejudice. And then we can say, I'm not a racist, I'm not an anti-Semite, story's over. Once we make that move, it's going to be all the harder for us to do the kinds of things that Barbara and I and other people have been talking about over the course of this program.
Absolutely. And Michael, if I might just make one last statement,
Please.
I want to quote Darius Stola, very, very wise historian, and our marvelous director for 5 years at POLIN Museum. And he once said, and I'm paraphrasing, and that is that we are not responsible for what people before us did, but we are responsible for what we do with that knowledge. And that seems to me to be absolutely critical in our discussions today. Thank you.
Tim, Barbara, thank you so much. I think we could have gone on. We can keep going. I look forward to the next time we have an opportunity to bring you in conversation together. This has been a wonderful conversation. So thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you.